is the second part of my videos about immigration fraud and the use of domestic violence accusations. My earlier video introduced you to Malcolm Henke, who's just won this big legal battle staving off false domestic violence accusations. He'd been married to his Indian wife for 2 years when she made accusations against him. He was lucky because he was able to prove the woman was actually the violent one in their marriage. And he had the money to fight off the charges, despite the woman being coached by a local women's group to throw every possible accusation against him. He's one of the lucky ones. There are men across the country who are marrying women from overseas and then find themselves facing false charges as she uses domestic violence as a fast route to a permanent visa. Men without Malcolm's resources can easily find themselves in prison if they can't afford to hire lawyers to protect themselves from these sorts of charges. I was contacted recently by a woman whose husband is a lawyer, and they wrote to me about the tragic story of one of their young clients.
The young man is a refugee here on a protection visa. He is 21 years old, got married last year, and was married for 1 month when the 19-year-old bride accused him of domestic violence and assault. She went to the police with the accusation, and the young man was charged. When the bride went to the police with her accusation, she was of course believed, but the bride's family met with the husband's family and demanded $50,000 for the matter to be dropped. The husband's family said no. It transpires that the bride had been married previously and had done this before in exactly the same circumstances, and $50,000 was extorted from the previous husband's family. In that case, the bride had broken a glass and inflicted cuts on herself. There was a grave risk for the young man because he is a refugee here on a protection visa. Had he been convicted, he would have been put in prison and then, when released, would have been deported. Luckily, the case was dismissed with costs, a great relief for the young guy and his family.
Take a look at this television story from News 4 in Washington.
When most Americans walk down the aisle and say I do, they think that love will last forever.
Hit the lottery. I'd found the woman of my dreams.
This military officer, we'll call him Tony, woke up from that dream very quickly. He and his Russian bride, Natalia, dated for about a month and a half before they got married.
When did you realize something was up?
1 week later.
In the few days it took Tony to get them an apartment, he says Natalia was gone, back with her old boyfriend.
It was like somebody flipped a light switch.
And that was just the beginning. Tony says a couple of months later, Natalia was back, begging to stay with him, claiming that old boyfriend was abusing her. Tony agreed, but says things got even stranger. Like when she called the police to report that Tony's video game was too violent and scaring her.
She tried everything she could to get me to lose control, to lose my temper.
Now he thinks he knows why. An immigrant claiming protection under the Violence Against Women Act, or VAWA, is entitled to legal assistance, benefits, even a fast track to permanent residence in the U.S. And Tony says when he tried to tell investigators he was the victim of marriage fraud, it didn't matter.
They would not look at it. I was really disappointed in our immigration laws.
So is John Sampson, who spent 27 years enforcing those laws as an INS and ICE agent.
It's a dirty little secret that most Americans have no idea.
He says in the 10 years since he retired, roughly 1,500 Americans have contacted his consulting firm, saying they're victims of marriage fraud.
I've had engineers, doctors, lawyers, dentists, you name it. I've had them all say, how could I have been so stupid? And my answer is, you weren't stupid, you were in love.
Each year, roughly 450,000 U.S. citizens marry foreign spouses and petition to get them legal permanent residency. It's one of the shortest paths to citizenship, and Sampson says fraud in one-on-one cases is almost never pursued.
Here's another one from NBC 10 in Philadelphia.
I flat out missed her and I loved her, and I finally said, you know what, I'm ready now.
But Dolly's marriage wasn't even 1 year old when he returned home from a business trip to find the wife he'd sponsored into the country had moved out.
She said, I've left you because you were abusive and I felt my life was endangered. Those exact words. And I was flabbergasted.
Dolly is emphatic that there was never any physical or emotional abuse, and we could find no court or police records to indicate otherwise. He now believes the marriage was a sham, and his non-citizen wife is claiming abuse in order to be divorced and stay in the United States.
I am a victim of fraud.
I was fascinated to discover lawyers in America are blatantly touting for business, encouraging women to come forward and use VAWA, that's the Violence Against Women Act, VAWA regulations to flaunt immigration laws. Look at this video from Blandon Law Firm in Florida, which proudly boasts of 100% success in using VAWA to get green cards for battered women and their children. Below the video, the firm points out that they achieved this 100% success rate without any need for police reports or medical records. Of course, that's been one of the great achievements of feminism. You don't need any evidence whatsoever to get away with making false accusations about domestic violence. I was most amused to see a really indignant woman writing on townhall.com about the fact that the tables had actually been turned on her. Here she is describing how her immigrant husband used the Violence Against Women Act to allege she was a battered husband.
My young children were taken from me due to an immigration loophole. I was arrested and my 4-year-olds were placed in foster care. We were separated for 4 months, and one of those months I spent in jail. My government didn't rush to our aid because my immigrant husband had successfully utilized an immigration loophole, the Violence Against Women Act, VAWA. Facing deportation in federal immigration court for marriage fraud, he filed a claim as a battered and abused spouse under VAWA and received immediate deferment. Entering into a discussion with the American named in the claim is prohibited. There is no interview, no investigation, no due process. The claim is accepted prima facie. The immigrant accuser is accepted as the victim, and the American accused is accepted as the abuser. Denying the constitutional right to due process is anti-American. In the absence of judicious decision-making, where vulnerable immigration policy is concerned, fraud flourishes. This is especially true for the immigration provisions of VAWA.
Don't you love her fury about this denial of basic human rights, this flaunting of the law? What's the bet? She wouldn't have given a damn if the only victims of this fraud were men. Now I want to talk to Augusto Zimmermann about all this. He's a law professor in Western Australia, a former law reform commissioner, and a ferocious campaigner against the dangerous domestic violence laws which are destroying the lives of so many men in this country. Hello, Augusto.
Hello, Bettina. It's a pleasure to talk to you again.
Well, I always enjoy talking to you. I hope my viewers know something about you. I'm going to put details. We did a video before about a previous talk we had about domestic violence, and I'll put details of that below this video. You've been speaking out about your concerns about domestic violence laws for many years now.
Yes, indeed. It has been a major problem in this country. And what I have in mind is the protection of the innocent, is due process of law to be applied. It's the truth, because some of these accusations might be false. We have to be able to determine the facts and to be able to protect those who are really innocent in this matter.
Absolutely. Now, we first started talking about immigration fraud and domestic violence a few years ago when you received a letter from a PhD student whose wife was making false allegations to try to get permanent residency. And I'm going to let people listen to some of his letter.
I am an international student and migrated to Australia to do my PhD with my wife as my dependent. I and my wife had some differences from the very beginning of our marriage. However, her attitude became very aggressive after we came to Australia. She has a nature of uncontrollable anger and at times becomes violent with me, throwing a standing fan on me at one occasion, and so on. Since 2014, she has threatened me many times, suggesting she will make false allegations against me of domestic violence if I do not listen to her. I have always ignored those threats until last month when she called the police and made false allegations against me. She told the police that I grabbed her neck and assaulted her. However, the police who attended the event did not note any visible evidence of physical attack on her body, which is true because I did not even touch her. She also told police that I did similar physical assaults to her in the past, but that time she did not approach the police, and again there was no visible evidence of any physical assault. Therefore, the police did not arrest me, saying the case was uncertain. Nevertheless, she went back to the police again 3 days after the so-called incident occurred and asked for an intervention order. Then the police called me for a chat over the incident and put me under arrest without asking anything, claiming to protect the victim, my wife. Currently, I'm on bail. The charges that were put against me are aggravated physical assault and aggravated life threat, as she also told police that I threatened to kill her. I know she wants to stay in Australia, and a domestic violence case can help her get a visa. She has visited a migration agent and has discussed the possibility of getting permanent residency in Australia.
Yes, indeed. This was an Indian PhD student. I can't give you further details, but he sent me this email saying that he was actually on bail, being falsely accused of domestic violence. As far as I know, the accusation is completely false. But that was the way the sponsoring partner could remain in the country even after the breakdown of the relationship. That's the only way a person can stay in the country after the breakdown of the relationship, is making a false accusation of domestic violence.
Until they get their permanent residency visa, is that right? So it's really in those first 2 years that it's really advantageous for women to make that sort of accusation. Yeah, I mean, I just did a bit of Googling. We'll show some of these quotes from some of the regulations, just going on one website after another, which is saying to people, you can stay in Australia if your relationship breaks down, if you claim to have being abused. And it's there again and again, as really encouraging women that this is the way they can get out of a marriage where they don't want to be and still get a permanent residency visa.
Yes, indeed. And the New South Wales government has on one of its websites an information saying that if you are feeling emotionally unhappy, if you're feeling that he's not treating you the way you would like to be treated, that is domestic violence. That is enough, including if she doesn't have a joint bank account, because they talk about financial difficulties and things like that. So in many ways, what's happening is that the governments here in Australia, some of them are actually inciting people to believe that they are being victims of domestic violence.
Yeah. And one suspects that there are people overseas who know that this is a way to get into Australia, to fight someone to marry them, and then allege domestic violence early in the relationship. And that way they can, don't have to worry about being married to this man for very long.
Yeah, well, you have to be very careful. What I have to say to my fellow Australians is that they have to be extremely careful. If they want to be in a relationship with a foreigner, there is always this risk, because as I'm saying, if the relationship breaks down, if the person wants to stay in this country, she can indeed make a false accusation. It's the only way. And of course, this person can have problems with the judicial system, needs to prove sometimes his innocence, and it can be very costly indeed, both financially and emotionally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you said to me that you found a case where a man who's been in this situation is taking action against the government. Is that right?
Well, that's true. Like, this person has been one of the victims, and of course this woman made this allegation. Now it's proven to be entirely false. and he's suing the police for that. And it seems that he won the case, which is a good victory. We need to have more people actually now fighting against this to see if we can recover this thing that is so important for this country, that is the protection of the rule of law, and that we can never undermine due process and natural justice.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, it's not just in Australia, it's overseas as well. And Augusto, I sent you this really good information. There's an organization called SAVE, S-A-V-E, which means Stop Abusive and Violent Environments. They're doing fantastic work and have been doing so for many years, putting together evidence about the dangerous impact of domestic violence regulations and the whole campus rape campaign, which are really, of course, tilting laws so firmly against men. Anyway, they did this report on the American Violence Against Women Act, which is called VAWA, and showed how that act is absolutely promoting immigration fraud. And I'm going to show our viewers now some of the issues they highlight in that report. And we'll just go through some of those, and then we can talk a bit about them.
Educates immigrants how to take advantage of the VAWA domestic violence provisions. Weakens traditional standards of proof, requiring only a personal statement by the immigrant or a restraining order. Allows immigrants, some with criminal backgrounds, to self-petition for a green card based on claims of domestic violence. Provides free legal services to immigrants who claim abuse. Substantially broadens the definition of domestic violence to include emotional abuse, jealousy, possessiveness, and trying to get legal custody of children. The person accused of abuse can't give evidence about the immigrant's fraudulent or criminal behaviour.
All sorts of things, Augusto, that we have talked about before, mentioned by SAVE in that article, including, of course, this issue of broadening the definition of a violence. So under the Act, domestic violence now includes emotional abuse, possessiveness, trying to get legal custody of the children. Isn't that extraordinary? That is included in the definition of violence, or being possessive or jealous. I mean, all this stuff. And of course, we've seen this here, and it's very much part of the regulations in America now.
Indeed. And that's one of the main problems, that anything goes now. The concept has been dramatically expanded. But can you imagine if this is combined with the fact that you don't need to have a proper judicial decision on this matter? You can actually have perhaps a social worker who has been completely biased because, of course, you know, in many ways she has been selling this idea that women need to be protected even against sorts of things such as emotional abuse, financial abuse. As you say, anything goes at this point. So it's a very tempting idea that if you like to live in this country or even in the US, because you say this is happening elsewhere as well, that's the only way you can stay in Australia, is by destroying another person's life. It's the only way. That's the main problem.
Yeah, main problem. But then we have, I mean, as this SAVE document shows, we've got under the Act, the VAWA Act, they've got $65 million a year for legal assistance in dealing with these sort of cases. And, you know, I've shown examples of the law companies in America touting for business for people for women particularly, who can get making immigration claims using domestic violence. So you've got this huge bureaucracy encouraging women to take this sort of action, which is really scary. And there's no question that's happening here as well. Yeah,
and some of these websites, they only use one gender to claim that this gender has been victimized. Sometimes what we see here is actually a sexist behavior, because it's about only women being the victims. We know very well that sometimes a victim can be a man of real domestic violence. So what these websites are doing is to interpret this from a feminist perspective that claims that women are always the victims, men can never be the victims, and we don't even need to, because as we have mentioned, the rules of evidence are completely lifted, and the person has to be, basically her word has to be taken for granted. It's a very terrible thing that tells us that the legal system is terribly going on now. It's actually undermining the whole idea of the presumption of innocence even.
Yeah. Well, it'll be really interesting, Augusto. I mean, obviously there'll be people listening to this who've been in this situation, who've had to deal with false domestic violence accusations by someone who's trying to get a visa. And I'd like to hear from you if you've had any experience with this. Well, it's a shocking, ongoing story we're dealing with. Augusto, I'm sure I'll talk to you many times again about what's happening here. You're one of our great crusaders in the area, and it's always a pleasure to have an opportunity to talk to you.
Thank you very much, Bettina. I greatly admire your work. Keep up the good work.